Si te quieres divertir con encanto y con primor, solo tienes que vivir.
¿A dónde?
Un verano en Nueva York.
Nueva York.
Si te quieres divertir con encanto y con primor,
¿Pero qué es?
solo tienes que vivir.
Y este frío.
Un verano en Nueva York.
Un ratito nada más. Ey, ey, ey. 4 de julio, verde y July. Ando con mi prima borracha Rulay. Los míos en el Bronx, saben lo que hay. Con la nota en hoy, por Washington hoy. Willy Colón me dicen el malo. Ey, porque pasan los años y sigo dando palos. Vendiendo discos como cuadro Frida Kahlo. El perico es blanco, sí, sí, el tusi racista. No te confundas, no, no, mejor evita. Ey, un shot de cañita en casa de Toñita. Y PR se siente cerquita, sí, sí, sí. Tengo el campeonato, nadie me lo quita.
Cerveza nuevo, no me one de cerveza nuevo, ¿ok? Puerto Rico.
Como Bad Bunny va a ser rey del pop, ey, con reggaeton y dembow, ey, con reggaeton y dembow, sí, con reggaeton y dembow. Como Bad Bunny va a ser rey del pop, ey, con reggaeton y dembow. Me siento como el lápiz en capa del dough. Cuando yo nací fue que nació el flow de low a low. Ping pong, flow pesado, Big Pong, con silenciador le robamos las gotas. J-Bone, ey, yo estoy en la mía, no tengo adversario, no. Con los Yankees los me aguanzato, a correr que otra vez la sacamos al estadio.
Con encanto y con primor, solo tienes que vivir.
Ya mismo nos vamos.
Un verano en Nueva York.
Cuidado que nadie nos escuche. Cuidado que nadie nos escuche. Cuidado que nadie nos escuche. Cuidado. Tú tienes piquete, mami, yo también. Tú estás buena, yo estoy bueno también. Huelo rico y ando con los de 100. Si tú lo quieres, lo tienes que mover. Tú tienes piquete, mami, yo también. Tú estás buena, yo estoy bueno también. Huelo rico y ando con los de 100. Si tú lo quieres, lo tienes que mover. Lo tienes que mover. Lo tienes que mover. Lo tienes que mover. Lo tienes que mover.
Ay, PR es otra cosa.
Yo la conocí en Miami, en Brickell. Ella sabe que aquí hay ticket. Quiere que yo se la aplique, que pa' casa la trafique. Voy a llevarte pa' PR, mami, pa' que veas cómo es que se perrea. Tráete a tu amiga si te gusta la idea. Dile que esta noche vamos a janguear. Qué rico la vamos a pasar. Aquí nadie se va a casar, pero tú te vas a querer quedar. Ay, ay, aprovecha que estoy soltero. Single, mírame mal si quieres que te singa. Te voy a llevar pa' PR todo el finde. Después de mí vas a borrar Tinder. Y estoy suelto, mami, estoy suelto. Mírame ahora perreando un experto. Estoy suelto, mami, estoy suelto. Ay, 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 hoy la calle está prendida. Juga pastilla molida. Yo no pierdo tiempo, yo la cambio como Rosalía. La que me mira a los ojos por 5 segundos, ya yo sé que es mía. ¿Dónde están las malas? Que son bienvenidas. Estoy puesto por lío. Dime si tu lía, tu amiguito, el corillo están bien rica, pero ese culo tuyo, wow, sobresalía. Salimos de la disco y estaba de día. Obviamente salí con la que quería. Ey, que viva la putería. Dale pa' atrás, tan, tan chulería. Ey, dime si te vas a montar. A la isla tengo el portal. Bien borrachos los tres. Baby, a las dos me las voy a llevar. Oh, oh, me quiere besar. Ja, yo que la puse mal. Tírate fotita ahora, porque ahorita te voy a peinar. Yeah. Voy a llevarte pa' PR, mami, pa' que veas cómo es que se perrea. Tráete a tu amiga si te gusta la idea. Dile que esta noche vamos
Muy buenas tardes, good evening everyone. Gracias por acompañarnos. Mi nombre es Danny y soy organizador con Media Justice. My name is Danny and I'm an organizer with Media Justice. Estamos iniciando esta tarde nuestro evento. We're kicking off our event this evening. Before we do that though, I'm going to pass it over to Patri, who is going to give us interpretation instructions, as today's event is going to be interpreted in English and Spanish simultaneously. Antes de iniciar con el evento, voy a pasar el micrófono a Patrick, quien va a darnos instrucciones de cómo acceder a la interpretación, ya que el evento de hoy será interpretado simultáneamente de inglés a español. Patrick.
Gracias, Danny. Thank you, Danny. Voy a hacer este anuncio primero en español y después en inglés de forma consecutiva y luego comenzaremos con la interpretación simultánea. I'm going to share the instructions in Spanish, then in English, and then we will start the simultaneous interpretation. Entonces, queremos dejarles saber que en el evento de hoy contamos con dos intérpretes que se van a estar alternando para interpretarle plenamente de forma simultánea todo el evento de hoy. Para poder acceder al canal de español, deben ir al icono del globo terráqueo que está en la parte inferior de su pantalla de Zoom. Cuando van ahí, deben escoger donde dice el idioma de ya sea inglés o español, en este caso sería español, y cuando escogen eso van a básicamente estar en el canal de español, lo que significa que todo lo que se interprete al español lo van a escuchar, así también como si en algún momento algún panelista habla en español. Para las personas que están en su teléfono o en una tableta, el menú es es casi igual, pero tienen que asegurarse de ir hasta donde dice más, en la parte derecha, tienen que quizás rodar todas las opciones del menú hasta llegar a más. Y cuando le dan a más, les va a salir igual donde dice interpretación con el icono del globo terráqueo. Súper importante, si están en su teléfono, cuando escojan el canal, deben asegurarse de apretar el botón de listo en la parte superior derecha. También les va a salir una opción de silenciar el audio original. Eso es a discreción de usted, no afecta la interpretación. Hello, everybody. So today's event is going to be interpreted between English and Spanish. Some of the panelists or some of the speakers might want to express themselves in Spanish today. So we want to make sure you're also set up in that English channel in case that happens. You're going to go to the bottom of your screen where it says, where there's a globe icon on the menu that says more. You might need to scroll towards the right if you're on a tablet or a phone to make sure that you find that more. And when you get there, you're going to select English. And that's going to start the English channel, so you will hear everything in English, regardless of what language is spoken, in case Spanish is spoken at some point. And if you are on your tablet or your phone, you have to make sure that you hit the button that says done at the top right corner to make sure it actually activates. Okay, thank you everybody. Gracias a todo el mundo. Entonces se lo paso de vuelta al equipo de facilitación.
Right on. Thank you, Patri, and welcome to WTF, the Rise of the Tech Broligarchy, a biweekly political education series that's brought to you by Media Justice. I'm Steven Renderos.
And hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. I'm Danny, and we're coming to you live on Zoom and across different social media platforms. And we'd love to hear from you today, right before we get into the program. Where are you joining us from? Why are you here? What motivated you to join us this evening? So yeah, drop it in the chat, please, whether you're here on Zoom or whether you're on social media. We'd love to hear from you. I see we have, already almost like 100 of us are on Zoom right now. So, please jump in. Let us know why you're here today. We'd love to hear you.
Yeah, and shout outs to all the people also tuning in via the social media platforms that we haven't been banned from. Shout out to y'all on Facebook and on some of the other platforms as well. I'm seeing Berkeley. What up, Berkeley? We're seeing Central Florida, originally from Honduras, a little fellow Central American, Danny. We got a little Central American action going on here.
That's what's up. I see the homies from Migrantes Unidos are here today. From Morocco, international support too. That's what's up. LA. I saw somebody
Yeah, shout
jump.
out to LA.
Yeah,
Shout out
shout
to
out to
LA.
LA. Yep. With two LA kids here today. So yeah, definitely love that. And why else? What brings y'all here? I saw somebody said they're here because WTF. Like, you know, what is happening, right? Definitely, I feel that.
There we go. All the LA people are about to start popping out. I just also saw Wisconsin, so shout out to Scotty, and shout out to Nashville, Sananto, and shout out to Kentucky. We love our Appalachia folks. El Salvador and Minnesota, right on.
For sure. People who are, you know, seeing the expansion of surveillance, seeing that's a real concern. Folks who are artists, right? Seeing this as an important piece of their work too. That's beautiful.
That's right. All right, let's keep it rolling. Um, so, for those of you who missed our last session, let's quickly recap what we covered. We talked about the trajectory of the TikTok ban, debunking the rhetoric around why a ban is necessary and the real motivations behind the forced sale of TikTok to the US. So, newsflash, it's not about protecting our privacy. It is straight up just about helping a member of the tech oligarchy purchase TikTok.
That's right. And I don't know if folks saw it, but there was already news earlier today that apparently Amazon, out of all monopolies, right? Because that's what it is a monopoly making a bid to try to buy TikTok, which we know that corporation is one of the most violent, one of the worst examples of data extraction that we need to really be aware of. And so that's why it's exciting to be in this conversation here today. And just to recap a little bit about, right, the lessons that we drew from exposing the tech bros so far, the ones who are benefiting from the forced sale of one of the most popular social media apps in the world. One is forcing TikTok to sell to a US company does not protect user data, right? Whatever the politicians might say, whatever the corporations might say, we know that's not true. They just profit off of our data. We also shared that the current prediction is that TikTok might be, for example, owned by Oracle, but I just shared the latest news, right? Either way, it's looking like it's going to be one of these Broligarchs. And so we got to be careful about where this is going. But corporations like Oracle, for example, they weaponize tech by surveillance of protesters, sell policing technology to Israel, China, and other countries. And last, TikTok is just the most recent example of how the tech oligarchy uses wealth to capture platforms.
Yeah, and by capturing platforms, we're talking about owning media infrastructure. And the problem is that when billionaires own the media infrastructure, they're also able to control narratives, narratives that dehumanize people and that justify the terrible, terrible actions of those in power. Um, and all the while just growing the profits of the tech oligarchy. I'm sure many of us by now have seen the like horrible images of students being snatched off the streets, migrants being like detained and processed for deportation or being exported to places like El Salvador. So, those actions, as we're seeing them happen, don't just happen because the state has the power to do those things. There's like narratives that are helping like dehumanize people that justifies those actions. So take Mark Zuckerberg, for example, his recent changes on the Facebook platform to eliminate fact checkers and loosen content moderation rules. That's directly led to the rise of right-wing voices using Facebook to like call migrants quote unquote trash, quote unquote criminals, quote unquote terrorists. And this allows the humanity of migrants to be rendered invisible, and it's how a student like Rumesa Oster can be snatched off the streets in broad daylight. It's how nearly 250 migrants get sent to a Salvadorian max prison. The tech oligarchy is enabling this moment, and it's not just through the media infrastructure they own, right, Danny?
Yeah, 100%. You know, and that's what today's about, right? We're gonna follow this thread and dive deep into like what the is tech doing on immigration, you know? You've probably seen all these headlines recently showing anti-immigrant enforcement expanding ICE's dangerous practices, using violent rhetoric to try and justify the expansion of this violent system of criminalization and surveillance. And we can't mistake these attacks on migrants as just against migrants, right? The reality is this is a project of mass criminalization of non-citizens that then also provides police agencies with tech weapons that they can then turn and use on anyone, right? Who dissents against Trump and the violent right-wing agenda. Anybody who speaks up against the genocide in Palestine, or as we're seeing now, even uh, Musk crying about people protesting Tesla, right? And now they're trying to start criminalizing that in very expansive ways. So the reality is we all have a stake in this fight, right, against policies that criminalize and surveil migrants, because we recognize the threats that something like that poses for all of us. And much like post 9/11, where Islamophobic rhetoric fueled the mass militarization of police across the country under the guise of quote unquote the terrorist threat, right? The state and corporations are manufacturing conditions to build a surveillance infrastructure that threatens all of us.
Exactly. By now, many of you have likely heard anecdotal stories, even of how US citizens are experiencing draconian policies. I think the bigger point here is that what we're seeing is the most vulnerable among us are being targeted first, but eventually these kinds of tactics affect the rest of us. In Chicago, a man who was born in the United States was arrested by ICE, and many of these arrests are warrantless. But I think the thing that is tying all of them is there is discrimination behind them. There is racism behind these arrests.
Yeah, this system of incarceration and deportation is violent and white supremacist at the core, right? And so we're even seeing things like when folks are crossing the US border, even US citizens having their phones scanned and their data extracted just to enter the country. Many progressive activists are being targeted, and they're really saying now that it's better to travel with the prepaid phone, for example, than like your usual phone, something like a track phone, rather than being potentially detained for holding different views, right, that dissent from the Trump administration. This is an agenda of fear that the Trump administration, the Trump regime, right, is pushing. And even folks are even like canceling travel, right, for the foreseeable future. And so it's very, very dangerous what we're seeing now. And, taking into consideration, following the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil and the arrest of Lakia Cordia, both part of pro-Palestinian protests at Columbia University. We've also seen federal agents detain a researcher at Georgetown University, Badar Kansuri, and revoke his visa. And these examples are folks who have been vocal about Palestinian rights, right? So like Suri and his wife have been speaking up for Palestinian rights, and both have been doxxed and smeared by what's called the Canary Mission, in a quote anonymously run blacklisting site. This site alleged that Suri's wife, an American citizen from Palestine, has, quote, worked for Hamas, expressed support for Hamas terrorism, and called for Israel's destruction, end quote. And this is just, again, the manufacturing of criminalization, targeting of people of color who are fighting for justice. And I repeat, just to be very clear, these are allegations from a anonymously run site, right? So it's really dangerous.
I mean, speaking of anonymously run sites, this is similar also to what we saw with Yale Law School scholar Alia Dutahi, who was suspended after an AI, an artificial intelligence run news site, called her a member of a quote terrorist group. So what we're seeing is way beyond law enforcement going after undocumented communities. We're seeing an attack on pro-Palestinian activists, on students, on scholars, and yes, even immigration attorneys.
Yeah, in fact, in January 2025, Trump signed an executive order enforcing stricter vetting rules for individuals seeking refuge, permanent residency, or work opportunities in the US. And so they are mandating the inspection and screening of social media, right, for evidence of, quote, subversion. So you can guess from what we've shared so far what subversion refers to, right? It's pretty obvious. But don't worry, if you happen to be somebody with bank, right, who can like just throw $1 million on the table, you can get a gold visa apparently nowadays, right? And that's real. That's not an Onion headline. That's legit.
All right, so returning to the focus, obviously this political education series is called WTF, The Rise of the Tech Broligarchy. Um, what is true is that none of this heightened crackdown would be possible without big tech's lucrative surveillance machine. Between immigration and customs enforcement, otherwise known as ICE, and customs and border protection, otherwise referred to as CBP, there are 23 ongoing tech-related contracts for everything from border infrastructure to facial recognition software. Of course, some of these oligarchs we've been talking about in the series are on the receiving end of immense profits for these contracts.
Yeah, and that includes tech oligarch that folks can see here, Palmer Luckey of Anduril Industries, who currently has a CBP contract for an autonomous surveillance tower, which just this month, Anduril was awarded a $642 million contract. Just to repeat that, $642 million contract by the U.S. Marine Corps to deploy an anti-drone system for bases and facilities. So they are really like raking in the money.
Yeah, and no surprise here, but another billionaire oligarch with a current ICE contract is investor of Palantir, Peter Thiel. Here we see him pictured with money. That's appropriate. Both these companies, actually, Anduril and Palantir, announced in December a partnership to actually harvest data from military equipment to train AI models. The press release they put out, they also invited other companies to partner with them to ensure that the US, quote, the US government remains the world leader in fielding advanced technologies that keep our citizens safe, end quote. Sounds like more propaganda that fuels the US war machine while increasing the balance in tech billionaires' bank accounts. Lucky for us, we're going to be talking to some partners in the field who are on the front lines of fighting back against both like the narratives, the rhetoric, and the very real harms of tech fueling surveillance, detentions, and deportations.
Yep, and we're so excited to be joined in conversation today by three movement leaders. Nana Giamfi, who's the executive director of BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, Paramita Shah, the founding executive director of Just Futures Law, and Cynthia Rodriguez, who is a national organizer with Mi Gente.
All right. I'd like to actually start by welcoming Nana Giamfi, Executive Director of BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration. Nana, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Thank you so very much for having me. Doing well. Excuse to everyone for some background noise you might hear. I am sitting up, leaving a session talking about how we fight the Broligarchy. And so I'm still in the hallway there, but really pleased to be here, joined by comrades.
That's right. It's totally appropriate for there to be noise because that's what we need to be doing right now is making noise. All right. I'm glad we're starting with you because in the context of immigration, Black people are often invisibilized, right? And yet, in the early days of the Trump administration, much of their immigration actions are targeting Black migrants, like the Department of Homeland Security revoking the legal status of 530,000 Haitians, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. Let me say that again, revoking the legal status of 530,000 migrants. Among them are Garifuna people, from Central America. Among them are Afro-Venezuelans, Afro-Cubans. So I'd love to maybe ask you if you could speak to why immigration actions from Trump seem to be targeted, not exclusively, but seem to be targeted towards Black migrants.
Thanks for that question, and thanks for noticing, because so many people actually have, as you mentioned, totally invisibilized Black immigrants, Black migrants, and clearly that is not what's happening on the part of the administrations and the governments of the United States. It is not a totally unusual thing for Black migrants to be targeted by the United States. We know that, in fact, the first immigration rules that passed in this country that restricted people were rules that were targeting Haitians when Haiti became free and there was still enslavement in the United States, and they were very concerned about making sure that those free Haitians didn't come over here and give folks ideas, to the putting of Haitians in concentration camps in Guantanamo, to the founding of the detention system, really on the backs of Haitians and other Black migrants who are coming as refugees. And then we saw, even before the election, talking about Haitians eating cats and dogs, and really the criminalization of Black migrants. Almost 80% of Black migrants who are deported because of contact with the police. And we know that's all because of anti-Blackness, and at that intersection of anti-Blackness and migrant rights. And so what we see with the Trump administration in the area of immigration and Black migrants is what we see with everything that he's doing. It's, with this whole machine fascist oligarchy is really lifting everything up to the extreme in an effort really to get people to self-deport, to get people to hide in the shadows, lock them up, keep them out, kick them out. That's really the theme song for the Trump administration, specifically as it pertains to Black migrants and, of course, other migrants of color.
Thank you for that, Nana. To bring it to the topic at hand, um, in December, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, body, released a report on AI and racial discrimination, and how it was impacting Black migrants and migrants of color. I was actually struck by the section where you detail out the different phases of migration and how migrants are impacted by technology. Um, Before arrival, at ports of entry, while in detention, at the point of release, when they're in the US. So I'm curious if you could share more about the different kinds of technologies that are deployed against migrants, and how do you see those conditions shifting under this version of Trump?
So, this is a piece a report that we did. It was requested by the UN Special Rapporteur on xenophobia and racism, based upon other work that Baji had done, looking at these different areas and different ways in which tech impacts Black migrants on this journey. So you have the capacity to get from one through, basically, really literally one side of the border to another side of a border, is impacted by technology. The information that is taken from migrants, Black migrants, as they're taking this journey, includes, facial recognition, and taking images of their actual faces. There was some time period when some of that technology wasn't working, but it was required in order for you, for example, to be able to get an appointment to get a credible fear interview for asylum, but it wasn't picking up dark faces. It wasn't picking up dark complexions. The biometrics and the way that that information is collected and that information is stored, obviously including fingerprints, but not limited to fingerprints in terms of the information that they're taking. The kind of tracking and cameras that you have, including that tracking and cameras that you have in detention, the ways in some of these detention facilities, there are prisons that you're able to get in and out, is again based upon information that has been collected and that is tracked. When folks get out, some people are required to get out with what we commonly refer to as an ankle bracelet, right? But it's not just in that type of electronic monitoring through those ankle shackles, but also through watches, which are given that, if you look at them, they look like an Apple Watch, but they're really have been provided by the Department of Homeland Security. Phones that, again, look like normal phones, but they are not. They've been given by a Department of Homeland Security, and they are literally like tracking you everywhere you go. They are tracking the information that you get into your phone. They're tracking your messages. They're tracking what you do on social media, what you download on social media. So it's just a continuous tracking process, some of which involves your actual self, right, in terms of your face, your biometrics, etc. Some of which involves data about your location, some of which involves data about, that's related to what you are listening to, what you are watching, how you are communicating with people. And so in this conversation about AI and the ways in which AI, of course, is touted as making things more efficient, as making things even fairer in some situations, like, oh, you're not in detention. Instead, you're being allowed out on this electronic, right, form of detention. But we know that because AI is just a reflection of empire, is a reflection of white supremacy, is a reflection of capitalism, is a reflection of imperialism, that there's no way that AI can be anything but harmful, violence as it pertains to Black migrants. And this plays out in the lives of Black migrants every day.
Mm. Mm. Let me expand on that last point that you were making, and this will be my last question to you. You wrote in that report that immigration policy is one of those places where colonial legacies exist, right? So let's build on what you were just saying. Can you share more about how Baji, what you all mean by that and how it relates to technology inside of immigration? Started going into this point that like there's only because of the context in which these technologies exist, they will replicate the harm. They won't necessarily solve for it. How are you seeing that play out right now?
And Nana, I'm sorry if I could just note real quick. We're getting a note from interpretation just to slow down a little bit so that way it can be interpreted. That's it. Thank you.
Sorry, I keep forgetting. I need to pretend and translate into my own language of tree to make sure that I talk slower. So thank you for that, and apologies to the interpreters. So when we talk about AI and these technologies, we know that these technologies, even the concept of why they're being developed for the war machine. They're being developed for imperialism. I'm kind of a science fiction head, right? And the notion that we had of what technology was going to do was that it was going to make it so they could just put some device on you and cure cancer, right? It was going to make it so that we could go and visit other countries and other planets and have other people and other beings visit here, that we were going to solve the issues of climate, that we would not have issues about people being hungry, that there would be no poverty. Like, these are the ideas behind what we thought technology was going to mean. But technology to empire is just an extension of empire and a way for empire to continue to consume, to continue to exploit, to continue to excavate, right? To continue to gain in violent ways to the harm of all of us. And the way that that plays out in immigration, and which of course has Black people as the first guinea pigs and the initial experimentals, right, on the way that this plays out, is to continue that colonialism, right? So to continue to be a tool for exploitation, to continue to be a tool for tearing down, for destruction, for categorization, right? To continue to almost have people digitally, like they would have our people in a jar, our parts in a jar that they hold in a museum. They have these digital parts of us that they now hold in their hands for their own purposes, and certainly to the detriment of our communities. And so we assert that until AI can be decolonized, and we have a theory of cosmic Ubuntu that we are talking about doing that with. But until we have an AI that is decolonial, there's no way that AI is something we should be accepting in the immigration space under any circumstances. And so we're pushing back against the use of AI, against the Broligarchy that is trying to do all that it can to make sure that technology continues to be the arm of empire that it has been since their technologies, may be very specific, since their technological development has been on hand.
Mm, mm. That's right. Their technology, not our technology. That's
That's
been
right.
Nana Gyamfi with the Executive Director of Black Alliance for a Just Immigration. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'll pass it over to Danny. Take us on to our next guest.
Oof. Yes, thank you so much, Nana, and thank you to Baji for all of the amazing work that y'all do. Now we're gonna speak with Cynthia Rodriguez who's a national organizer with Mi Gente. Cynthia, there you go. Welcome. And
Hey everyone, how's it going?
doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's a little bit rainy today in Chicago, but happy to be here and so honored to be speaking with y'all and Nana and Palomita. So thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. Thank you for joining us. And as a member of Mi Gente and folks who've been supporting the work following, we know that No Tech for ICE is a campaign that has been instrumental in exposing big tech for facilitating raids and deportations, for years that y'all have been anchoring that super important work. And recently you published an op-ed in The Nation, right, about y'all's work. And just hoping if you could share maybe a couple highlights from that piece, what you're trying to share with the community and what the fight looks like right now.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning it. So hey everyone, Cynthia with Mi Gente. Mi Gente is a national political home and organizing hub for Latinx folks across the US and Puerto Rico, but for years, in partnership with folks here, right, we've been um, working on the No Tech for ICE campaign. And so we wanted to, in this moment, be able to put something out that did a couple of things. And thinking about it today, in this op-ed, we talk a lot about like the oligarchy, and we're talking about a lot of these men behind it. But I don't know if folks saw today, Elle magazine did a cover with Lauren Sanchez and all of that crew going up to space. And so I was like, man, we got to talk about the Galigarchy too. But next op-ed. But in this one, we wanted to do a couple of things, right? We wanted to one, just really explicitly name all of these people. Because not only were they standing at the inauguration, besides in front um, with Trump, but what does it look like to make their work visible um, as the administration continues to do and commit all of this harm against our communities? And so we wanted to name that, when we hear about Trump, about Musk all the time. We can't forget, what this larger web of big tech and big data looks like and who they are. And then two, we wanted to put something out that reminds us and grounds us in how this affects all of us. That we need to be able to be really precise and name this is how it's impacting immigrant communities. And at the same time, what does this mean for all of us, and how has this already changed the landscape of policing in general, the landscape of surveillance in general, and how do we get grounded in that? Because, I was thinking about the title of this webinar and the series, and I was like, on a level from what to, can I curse? On a level of what to fuck, like, are we in the like, what is happening and what are we gonna do to get out of this hole? Or are we in the like, we are effed, you know? So we wanted to talk about how this affects us all and ground us in that so that we can also remember that just like all of these companies and all of these players are building with each other, um, and they have been to be able to create the infrastructure that led us to this moment. So have we, right? There's so much amazing work that has happened through the groups here. Um, that's also infrastructure, right, that we have that we can use to build on and continue to fight because, we're just about to hit the 100 days.
Yep, that's right. We're in it. We're like in the fight, right? And you were mentioning that there are things that affect all of us, right? Including in this like angle and campaign for No Tech for ICE. And one of those examples I feel like is Clearview AI, right? And so I know that some of us, including Mi Gente members, were in Chicago recently as we submitted objections to the Clearview AI settlement. And so I'm hoping, there are some folks here on the call who maybe don't know or online, right? Because, we're out there on social media platforms, as Stephen mentioned, the ones that haven't banned us, right? So folks who are listening, if maybe you could share with them about what that case around Clearview AI is about and why we were there.
Yeah, I mean, it's another like teamwork makes the dream work, right? So last year, myself actually and other Mi Gente members in Chicago filed objections to this Clearview settlement, and I'll talk about it and what it is. But I just want to say that this really was us joining a really great group of folks from different parts of the country that came together at the end of January to then share these objections in court with the judge that was overseeing the settlement because really in last year there was this massive effort by Just Futures Law, by y'all here at Media Justice, Fight for the Future, Mi Gente, to encourage folks to opt out of the settlement with Curvy AI. And hundreds of people did do that, right? And then this is why this is so important is because um, Clearview AI was coming to the table after having scraped billions of images, right? Not just like 1, 2 billion, but like 30 plus billion images on the internet. Like my mind can't even comprehend, right? How much that looks like. Like how many ants is that? Um, and so they've been stealing our faces off so many different parts of the internet to build up their database, and then making this information accessible to be sold, to be purchased for surveillance, for immigration policing, for policing at large. And so we've seen in recent times, right, other companies themselves push back, right, other competitors to Clearview AI in the surveillance space. There's been different legal fights in the US and internationally, but here in the US, several cases were consolidated into this class action here in Illinois. And so Clearview AI was reaching this table looking forward to settling this case. Um, to wash their hands off of any responsibility in terms of scraping the internet of all of our information in this way, and they were looking forward to continuing to do business as usual with no one saying anything, right? And so I would say all of our groups came together because we knew that we needed to come together to push back and to publicly say that the settlement was a joke, that what the company was saying was, you know, we'll give you a stake in the company, you person, right? You, Danny, Steven, Cynthia, we'll give you a stake in the company, which really means, maybe someday you'll get some pennies um, in exchange for us continuing to harvest and sell your face without your consent um, and giving up your right to sue in the future. So, like a fair exchange, right? No. So,
Ridiculous.
yeah. And so that's why we know that, and we have this saying in Spanish, right? Es plan con maña. Um, and so, when I think of that, I think of the way in which Clearview AI is working, these other big tech companies are working. Es plan con maña. It's their intention to operate in this way, without accountability, to laugh in our face, to do something so big, and so much of a spectacle, but at the same time for it to be invisible in a lot of ways, right? Because of the nature of tech and data. And so, and all of this with a history of the kinds of relationships that they have to the alt-right, right? Bringing back your picture of Peter Thiel and Palantir as they're back in the news for all sorts of things. So yeah, all of this to say, right, this wasn't the first time that our groups have shown up to call out Clearview AI for what they're doing. And it certainly won't be the last.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that update. I think it's really important, right? I remember being there listening to some of like the counter arguments or whatever, or else from the attorneys representing them, right? Like who wanted the settlement to happen. And they were trying to argue that, like, hey, we notified people that this thing is happening. And I'm in these circles, and I hadn't heard from any of y'all that this potential settlement that could affect me or other people, right, in my community was happening, right? And so definitely it's just a clear example of the way that our current system is designed to maintain these types of systems expanding, right? So thank you for sharing that and for and JFL and all the orgs who have helped to hold down that fight. And now like another example of like the data extraction and data sharing, right, that has been a big concern recently for a lot of our community members is the recent news, right, that the IRS is getting ready to share addresses of quote unquote suspected undocumented immigrants with ICE, right? And so, mi gente is no stranger to fighting this type of collusion. What do you think we can do to fight this, right? And we also got a question in the Q&A about, are there certain things that folks can do to like shield themselves from like, content to post or things like that, just in case if you have any recommendations like that too. But yeah, overall, like, what do you think our communities can do to fight back against these types of threats?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a big question, and I think my contribution um can be about the larger question, right? What do we do about data sharing with ICE? On the one hand, I was just in conversations about this today, and folks um are talking about responding to this agreement between, you know, the IRS and DHS, and they're requesting tax data. Folks are asking like, what can I do if I file my taxes? But to answer your question, I would say over the years, No Tech for ICE and our different groups have been fighting back against data sharing with ICE at large, bringing the alarm that actually data and tech is the new frontier of ICE policing, and we're seeing it in an unprecedented way right now, right? I think the points that was making are really important, especially when we think about like what are we really fighting back against, because we're I would say we're not fighting back against this one specific technology or just like this one company. And like, if for some reason, this company was about to shut down or like this technology couldn't work, like we would be done because we wouldn't. We would still be dealing with the underlying relationships of power, of race, of coloniality, um, of all these different systems that exist. Um, between our communities, the government, these companies, and so that's our larger fight, right? And so that's what I wanted to share, because I think that in this moment, we and so many of our groups are doing a great deal of like community defense work, having to do a lot of rapid response, and that's really important, really real right now, and like that's where a lot of our efforts are. Um, and I think one of the things that we're wrapping our heads around and moving around is how do we hold that we're both fighting to defend these things that we've won, or these protections that we have for our communities, or our rights in general, right, that have never been given, right, we've always had to fight for. And how do we hold that defense work and that rapid response work when at the same time we need to fight back and organize for the long term and for stronger protections. um, and how do we have those conversations in our community, right? um, because sometimes it can be um yeah, it can just fall a little tone deaf if we're like um we need all these things, but like we are stuck in this fight where we're also having to defend a lot of our work. So the other thing I would say is, we also fight back because one of the things that we hear so much in this work is that like this issue is so big. Um, there's nothing that we can do because the snowball of surveillance and policing has already gotten out of control. Um, and I'm not even, my family's not even from a place with snow, so like where does that leave me? But that overwhelming feeling of like the snowball effect that we feel is also being used as a cop out by by elected officials who are like, well, the problem's so big, so we can't really do anything. And so we have to fight back against that. And we have, right, over the years, we fought back against the ways in which data is shared with ICE through contracts with LexisNexis, Palantir, et cetera, all the things that folks have already named and that people can read more about. And we can share some links in the chat. And then we've seen just like the reach of data sharing expand so massively within the government itself. And those are some of the things that we've been pointing out to over the years, like why, the government has giant contracts with Amazon and Microsoft for cloud storage. Um, there's concerns about information sharing within and through our DMB systems, or even just internally, right? We've seen, particularly around COVID, like Palantir enter into contracts with the Department of Health and Human Services. And so all of this to say that, um, you know, we have fought back and we're going to continue to fight back. And that means we're going to have to organize. And that means that we're going to have difficult conversations about how do we hold both the things that we need to make sure that we are able to maintain and keep that folks have fought for, and also what else can we create. And, I'll just also then share really quickly that in terms of this in particular with the IRS and ICE and their, shady negotiations, um, this past month, some of our members, Mi Gente members, are also part of other organizations, particularly worker centers in the Chicagoland area. And Centro de Trabajadores Unidos on the southeast side of Chicago joined Public Citizen Litigation Group and other folks to file a lawsuit um, to take on, right, this that's happening. So more to come there. But yeah, we need to be able to share and break down what's happening with our communities and bring our folks with us, even when it feels like such an overwhelming and like, you know, something that we can't always see.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cynthia. It's definitely right. And we got to work to protect our folks in all different ways, including, demanding that these corporations and oligarchs keep providing their tech weapons to police agencies like ICE. So yeah, appreciate you. And I'm going to pass it over to Stephen for our next part of the conversation.
That's right. Our final part of the conversation. Thank you, Cynthia. I'm excited to continue moving with the executive director of Just Futures Law, Paramita Shah. Thank you for joining us, Paramita. I'm sure you'll pop up on my screen. There you are. What's up? How you doing?
Hey, it is nice to see you and nice to hear this amazing conversation. Um, like slightly mind-boggling, but really glad to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Well, I feel a lot of hope that I get to be in these mind-boggling conversations with folks like yourself and Cynthia and Nana. So let me start here with you. It's easy to conclude that the way that technology is being leveraged right now in immigration is somehow very unique to Trump. Um, so I'm curious for you, what similarities do you see in the way that the past two administrations thought about technology, particularly as it relates to the immigration system?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a long story, for DHS and the use of technology. And even though we're like this in this extraordinarily challenging moment, it really falls within the zeitgeist of like magical thinking that the tech bros have laid out for all of us, in terms of what they think the tech can do. But the fact is that, nearly every administration has been cuddling with and has been coddling, right?
Mm.
Uh, the tech industry. And they have been all the federal agencies have been eagerly jumping on, right, to all the tech that they think is out there. And the bandwagon is so seductive that I think the reason why we actually came into being was to figure out where this tech was going, what it was doing, and what it was doing in the hands of DHS. And to do that, DHS is a very young agency, the Department of Homeland Security. And, it's worth realizing that this moment tracks with 9/11, in the way that DHS was meant to be, which was a domestic paramilitary force.
Mm,
And um, I think the reason why that's important is because now we should know that DHS has more armed federal agents than any other federal agency, right? It is one of the world's largest jailers. It has put more people on surveillance, right, than most other federal agencies. And, at the heart of DHS is that this reality that it touches on 46 million foreign-born people in the United States, right? And that means their families. So we are not talking about this sideline of immigration that's happening around the tech bros. This is really about an experimentation space that offers a lot of promise to them, and the way that they feel like they can test and try their technologies, really without any safeguards, without any limitations on a population that really doesn't have a lot of privacy rights, even though they have a ton of rights, right? It's just very easy to exploit this space. And so, you know, I think it's kind of an both administrations really, when they've been talking about AI or they talk about technologies, they really have named national security as an imperative, almost like a manifest destiny,
mm,
for them. And they started off with buying, like it's not just the Department of Homeland Security, it's the Department of Defense, it's the National Security Agency or ODNI, and they bought all the data, right? They wanted the data because what does the tech need is the data, right?
mhm.
Um, and then they brought in the tech oligarchs as collaborators and advisors, right, into the agencies. Either, using executive memos to pull them in or invites to say that, this is a collaboration. And we did this without knowing what the technology does, how far it goes, what's really under the hood. And we did it knowing that these agencies have basically opened not just a small loophole, but like the biggest exemption of how technology is treated, because law enforcement always gets an exemption for due process safeguards. And DHS, which is not known or lauded for its civil rights record, gets all the exemptions, right? Use this very powerful technology. And so when you look at the technology from Peter, people have mentioned Peter Thiel, who's made Palantir, which has set up platforms, right, for DHS, or Clearview AI, which is being used by DHS, but also almost every other agency, right? Or data brokers like LexisNexis or Thomson Reuters. The law enforcement exemptions means that these companies get to play, right, with the
Mm.
data and with the tech on us. And that
Let
is kind
me
of like what I feel like we haven't really, both administrations haven't really thought about that.
Right. So there's the like common through line between these two administrations. And I think to your point, what we're seeing now is the culmination of a 20 plus year project with the Department of Homeland Security that was born out of a major moment of crisis, that where a lot of norms were set aside because of that moment of crisis. And we're seeing the culmination of how that that agency can function with very few guardrails, if any. So let's pick up on those loopholes that you were talking about. Last year, towards the end of the year, Just Futures Law published a report called Automating Deportation. And it detailed the way that the Department of Homeland Security uses artificial intelligence. what did that report find? Speaking of these loopholes, and maybe more to bring it to the current moment, what are you seeing happening with Trump's Department of Homeland Security and its use of AI? How has it evolved?
Yeah, I mean, we were really thrilled to do this report with Mi Gente, and with so many amazing corporate researchers like Empower LLC. But I think firstly, it's kind of like good to remember that like DHS didn't even acknowledge that many of these AI programs that we mentioned in our report even existed. And so that's kind of the level of transparency we're up, against even under the Biden administration. But you know what? We focused on USCIS, which is the agency that processes just immigration applications, your naturalization application, your green card application, your visas. And what we found is that they were using programs like Asylum Text Analytics or another one called the I-539 score or hurricane scores. And what they really did is that these programs were automatically querying, like asking about applications that were filed within the agency and basically scanning them for fraud,
Mm,
scanning for security, right? And I think the worry was, that nobody knew what they were doing. Nobody knew what was in this AI algorithm black box, right? How did it work? How did they decide what fraud was, right, in the algorithm? Did they notify, the person or their attorney that, this finding had been made? Nobody really had that information, even though they were deploying the program. Um, you know, we also discovered, because we were worried, we've been tracking with other groups here, this use of, electronic monitoring, digital shackling, and they used a score, the hurricane score. And, that was a score which really was heavily weighted towards detaining people, right? Not releasing people. And yet that information was not known to the people who were under electronic monitoring, but it was being used. And so I think, those were things that we were worried about. But what came out of it was like, stuff that was much more chilling. We released the report. We did a ton of advocacy with so many others here, and Mi Gente and, signatories to letters that we sent over. And, I think what we know now is that DHS is doubling down, right,
mhm.
on AI, is doubling down on the tech. Palantir is going to be supporting target analysis of known populations, and populate tracking solutions for ICE, right? There are more drones in the pipeline. There are more surveillance tools on, on the student and exchange visitor information systems. It's called CVIS, through companies that produce programs like Babel, Fivecast, Onyx, Snapdragon. Those are all kinds of names that are coming up as contractors and programs within DHS.
Mm. Well, so we're running tight on time, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you one final question because we can end in that like, okay, everything is bad and they're doubling down and there's more technology and everything is effed. But I want to end with how do we fight this? Cynthia actually started going into this towards the end of her time with us. But since you're a lawyer, let me ask you about the laws, right? Many advocates that we know and love have leaned on privacy laws as a shield against the ways technology encroaches on our lives. You have state level privacy laws. There's been attempts at federal level privacy laws with those law enforcement carve outs that you've talked about. Um, and is this what we need to be fighting for, though? Do we need to be fighting for privacy? And maybe to get more specific, for those of us like horrified at seeing the images of people being snatched off the streets by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, how do we weaken their ability to leverage technology to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an important question. You know, we all need privacy. We all want our sensitive, confidential, personal information to be protected, and it should be, you know, by our laws. But now we know that privacy is not the shield, is not the guard that we thought it was. So I would say we must fight for privacy and we must fight for data protection, right? We need to fight to create the guardrails, you know, not only at the federal level, but in our cities and our towns. You know, we can start adding those kinds of protections. Many campaigns, you know, are afoot. You know, just talk to Cynthia about data protection. And I think those kinds of limits will take away the power of those companies to build in pipelines, right, to the marketplace that cities have where they pay, you know, they pay a lot of money, uh, essentially to give away their data. And so I think that we can work on local policies. I think that we can, you know, work with advocates who are trying to find new lawsuits. I think we can do the things that are about fighting the disempowerment, like believing that we can fight the data extraction and learning the tools. So many of us have created new safety tools to meet this moment as much as we can. And then I would say, like, pay attention to what's happening in your own city budget about what contracts are being bought and with who, because what you see at the federal government is definitely happening in your backyard. And so, you know, fighting those kinds of contracts and setting limits on what they can do is even going to be more important.
Paramita Shah, the Executive Director of Just Futures Law. Fight the contracts, fight the data. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. I want to say thank you to all of our speakers and just do a quick recap of the lessons from today's discussion. So number one, big tech fuels a lucrative surveillance, incarceration, and deportation machine between ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and CBP, Customs and Border Protection. There are currently 23 tech-related contracts, and there are at least 8 more potentially being considered. And so this expands the incarceration detention center machine, right? AI expedites criminalization. So I think Nana said it great, you know, without the colonial AI, we don't want it. And so let's focus on that. Let's be clear. And then the other thing is organizing is a must, right? Non-compliance with draconian policies is necessary right now. This is in our first round. This is in our first fight, right? We will continue to organize, and we know that we keep us safe.
Again, want to thank Nana, Cynthia, and Paromita for being with us today. And shout outs to all of y'all who have hung in with us. Please follow the work of Black Alliance for a Just Immigration, Mi Gente, and Just Futures Law. And lastly, the very last thing we're going to ask you to do is to take some action with us. I want to share an action that our friends at the Detention Watch Network have been putting out. They're in negotiations with, right now, Congress is in negotiations that could result in billions of dollars being funneled to the Trump administration to continue its mass detention and deportation agenda while cutting funding for vital programs like food stamps, Medicaid, and student loans. The action we want to direct you to today is write your member of Congress to tell them no more money for Trump's deportation machine. And this is an action, again, that's being hosted by Detention Watch Network. Please go off and do that.
Yes, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This wraps it up for our webinar. And please join us for our next episode of WTF, the Rise of the Tech Broligarchy, where we'll dive into what is the deal with AI, and we'll see y'all there. So thank you all.
Neta solo queda irme un día y solamente verte en el atardecer. Si me van sola y triste no me hablan. Si me van sola y triste soy culpable. La vida es una fiesta que un día termina. Y fuiste tú mi baile inolvidable. Y fuiste tú mi baile inolvidable.
Mientras uno está vivo, uno debe amar lo más que pueda.